My name is Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old, a widower, and a retired commercial construction contractor. I spent 4 decades pouring concrete, negotiating with ruthless suppliers, and building high-rises in Chicago, so my family would never have to know the meaning of the word struggle. I built my fortune with calloused hands and a sharp mind. I was never one to flash my wealth. I drive an old, reliable truck. I wear simple clothes, but I made sure my son Bradley had everything I did not. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 days before Thanksgiving. I was standing in the middle of a high-end grocery store in the suburbs, surrounded by people stressing over holiday menus. I was holding a massive $120 organic turkey. I had spent the last 20 minutes picking out the perfect bird. Martha, my late wife, used to take this holiday very seriously. Since she passed, I tried to keep the tradition alive. I was supposed to take this turkey to Bradley and Tiffany's house on Thursday morning to help with the cooking. I was actually looking forward to it mostly because it meant spending the day with my 7-year-old grandson Leo. He is the only true light in my life right now. I was just heading toward the checkout lanes when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and saw a notification from our family group chat. I put the heavy turkey down on the edge of a display freezer to free up my hands and opened the message. It was from Bradley, the son whose advanced business degree I paid for in full. The son who calls me every time his platinum credit card declines. The text read, "Dad, we have been talking. Thanksgiving this year is just going to be the core family. Me, Tiffany, and Leo. Tiffany's parents are coming from out of town, and we just want to keep the circle tight. You aren't invited." I stared at the screen. The core family. I read the words 3 times, feeling a slow, cold knot form in my stomach. Before I could even process the sheer disrespect of being uninvited to a holiday meal 2 days before the event, another message popped up. This one was from my daughter-in-law, Tiffany. She wrote, "We just need some peace this year, Harrison. You always bring such a heavy energy since Martha died. Maybe one day you will earn a seat at our table. Earn a seat at our table." Those 7 words hit me like a physical blow. I did not gasp. I did not drop my phone. I just stood there in the bustling grocery store, letting the absolute audacity of that sentence echo in my mind. Earn a seat at their table. The table in the dining room of the $2.5 million home in Winnetka. The home where I paid the 80% down payment in cash so they could afford the mortgage. The table situated next to the heated driveway where they parked the 2 luxury vehicles that I bought and currently pay the insurance on. The table where my grandson Leo sits to do his homework. Homework from a prestigious private academy that deducts $3,000 from my checking account on the first of every single month. They wanted me to earn a seat at a table that my sweat, my blood, and my money had purchased. For 3 years since Martha passed away, I had been the silent, invisible pillar holding up their pretentious, hollow lifestyle. I tolerated Tiffany's snide remarks about my worn-out work boots. I bit my tongue when Bradley acted like a big-shot executive while quietly relying on my wire transfers to cover his country club dues. I did it because I wanted peace. I did it because they were my family. I did it so I could see my grandson. I thought I was being a good father. But standing there staring at those glowing letters, the illusion shattered. I saw exactly what I was to them. I was an open wallet, an automated teller machine that they found socially embarrassing, a clueless old man who was expected to pay the bills and then quietly disappear into the shadows so they could pretend they built their perfect life themselves. The grief of losing my wife, the loneliness of an empty house, the desperate desire to keep my remaining family close, all of it vanished in a single heartbeat. In its place, the cold, calculating mind of a Chicago contractor took over. You do not survive 40 years in commercial construction by letting people walk all over you. When a foundation is rotten, you do not try to paint over it. You tear it out. I looked at the $120 organic turkey resting on the freezer glass. I realized I would not be needing it. I turned my back on the bird and walked out of the store. The sliding doors parted, and the crisp autumn air hit my face. It felt incredibly refreshing. I walked across the parking lot, climbed into the cab of my truck, and closed the door, shutting out the noise of the world. The cabin was quiet. I took my phone out again. The group chat was silent, probably waiting for my response. Waiting for me to argue, to beg, to ask what I had done wrong. They expected an emotional outburst from a lonely old widower. I did not give them one. My hands were perfectly steady as I typed my reply. Understood. Have a happy Thanksgiving. I am canceling all your auto payments immediately. I hit send. Then I permanently left the group chat. I did not wait for the read receipts. I immediately opened my banking application. My screen illuminated my dashboard. It was time to do some serious demolition. I navigated to the Scheduled Transfers tab. First on the list was the automatic payment for the Winnetka house mortgage. I pressed Cancel Series. Next was the private school tuition for Leo. I felt a brief pang of guilt, but I knew I could set up a direct, unbreakable trust for him later. For now, the tap had to be shut off. I pressed Cancel Series. Then came the auto insurance for their luxury cars. I pressed Cancel. The monthly transfer to Bradley's personal checking account, his hidden allowance. I pressed Cancel. The payments for Tiffany's high-end gym membership and the country club. Cancel, cancel. I systematically severed every single financial lifeline, connecting my bank accounts to their lives. It took me exactly 4 minutes to completely dismantle the safety net they had been comfortably resting on for the last 3 years. With a few taps on a glass screen, their luxurious, stress-free existence was over. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, turned the key in the ignition, and listened to the engine roar to life. I pulled out of the parking lot and took the scenic route back to my house. I drove past the lake, watching the gray clouds roll in. For the first time since my wife died, I did not feel a crushing weight on my chest. I felt light. I felt dangerous. It took me about an hour to get back to my property. The drive was peaceful, but my phone had not stopped vibrating the entire time. It buzzed and chimed relentlessly, sliding around on the leather seat. When I finally pulled into my driveway and put the truck in park, I picked up the device. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications. I had 105 missed calls. 80 of them were from Bradley. 25 were from Tiffany. There was a flood of text messages. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Dad, pick up the phone right now. Harrison, this is not funny. The bank just sent us a cancellation notice for the mortgage transfer." "Dad, please, we were just joking. We are just stressed. Call me back." I read them with a cold, humorless smile. They were no longer the arrogant snobs demanding I earn my place. They were terrified. The reality of paying their own bills had just crashed through their front door, and they were panicking. I stepped out of my truck and walked toward my front porch. The wind was picking up, rattling the dry leaves in the oak trees. I unlocked my front door and stepped inside the quiet, familiar warmth of my home. I was just taking off my coat when tires screeched outside. I walked to the living room window and pulled back the curtain. A familiar black luxury vehicle had just swerved recklessly into my driveway, its headlights cutting through the evening darkness, illuminating my front yard. The car I paid to insure. The car driven by the people who had just told me I did not deserve a seat at their table. I let the curtain fall back into place. The demolition had officially begun, and I was more than ready for the collapse. I watched from the window as Bradley slammed the car into park. He practically leapt out of the driver's seat of the sleek silver Porsche. That was the Porsche I removed from my auto insurance policy an hour ago. Tiffany followed closely behind him. She wiped her eyes, wearing an oversized cashmere cardigan, playing the distressed daughter-in-law perfectly. I took a deep breath and opened the front door before they could ring the bell. They stormed onto my porch. Tiffany immediately launched into her performance. She reached out, trying to grab my arm, her face twisted into a mask of pure agony. "Harrison, please, you have to listen to me." She gasped, letting out a dramatic sob. "You completely misunderstood my message. I am so sorry. I did not mean what I typed. I have been under so much pressure lately. My parents are flying in from Boston, and my doctor just adjusted my anxiety medication. It makes me impulsive. It makes me say crazy things. I love you, Harrison. You know you are family to us. I stood there on the porch, feeling the cold November wind brush against my face. I looked down at her manicured hands gripping my flannel sleeve. It was a spectacular show. If I were a weaker man, I might have believed the trembling lower lip and the tears welling in her eyes. But I spent decades dealing with union bosses and site managers who lied without blinking. I knew a fabricated story when I heard one. I gently but firmly pulled my arm away from her grasp. I did not say a word. I just stared at her, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. Bradley stepped forward, placing himself between me and his wife. He puffed out his chest, trying to project authority, but I could see the panic vibrating in his jaw. "Dad, this is completely out of line," he said, his voice rising in volume. "You cannot just cut off our accounts without warning because your feelings got hurt over a group text. Tiffany is dealing with severe stress. You are acting incredibly immature. Are you really going to let your old man's stubbornness destroy our family? Are you going to punish your own flesh and blood just to prove a point?" I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic energy. "Punish my flesh and blood," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the freezing air. "Is that what you call it, Bradley?" "Yes," he shouted, waving his arms toward the street. "You canceled the bank transfers. The mortgage payment is due on the 1st. The car notes are due next week. And what about Leo? Did you even think about your grandson before you threw this little tantrum? His private school tuition is automatically drafted on Monday morning. If that payment bounces, he loses his spot for the spring semester. You are willing to ruin a 7-year-old boy's education because you are too proud to accept an apology." He was using my grandson as a shield. He was hiding his own financial incompetence behind the welfare of a child. That was the moment the last remaining shred of my paternal sympathy evaporated into the cold night. I stepped closer to my son. I lowered my voice to a dangerous, steady calm. "Let us get a few things perfectly clear right now," I said, locking my eyes directly onto his. "I am not punishing Leo. I am securing my assets from 2 ungrateful adults who believe they are entitled to the fruits of my labor. You want to talk about stubbornness? Let us talk about mathematics instead." I watched Bradley swallow hard. The false bravado was beginning to melt away from his face. "Every single month, I transfer $12,400 to maintain your lifestyle," I said, articulating every syllable. $7,400 goes to the mortgage of a house I already paid 80% of in cash. $2,000 covers the lease and premium insurance for that German sports car sitting in my driveway. $3,000 pays for Leo's academy. I also cover the $800 monthly fee for Tiffany's exclusive country club, because apparently she needs a place to escape the terrible burden of having everything handed to her on a silver platter. Tiffany stopped crying instantly. Her mouth fell open in shock. She did not expect me to have the exact numbers memorized. She thought I was just a blind, generous fool. "I worked in commercial construction for 40 years. I continued, my voice sharp and unyielding. I poured concrete in sub-zero winters. I breathed in drywall dust and exhaust fumes. I ruined my knees and destroyed my back climbing scaffolding so that you would never have to know what physical labor felt like. I built a fortune through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, and I willingly shared it with you because I loved you. But I will be damned if I let you take my life's work and use it to humiliate me. You do not get to live like royalty on my dime and then tell me I am not good enough to sit at your Thanksgiving table." Bradley looked completely deflated. His shoulders slumped, and he took a step back, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. He was a man who played a successful executive on social media, but standing in front of me, he was just a scared child who realized his allowance had been revoked. "Dad, please," he whispered, the anger completely gone from his voice, replaced by raw desperation. "We are sorry. We were stupid. We are drowning right now. If those payments do not go through on Monday, the bank will penalize us. We will lose the cars. We will lose everything. Please, I am begging you, do not do this to us." I looked at the two of them shivering on my porch. I knew that if I confronted them with the full extent of my anger right now, they would go into defensive mode. They might try to hide whatever else they were doing behind my back. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to lower their guard so I could figure out why they were so eager to keep me away from the family gathering. I let out a long, heavy sigh, pretending to look exhausted and worn down by the argument. I rubbed my temples, acting like a defeated old man who just wanted peace and quiet. "Fine," I said softly, looking away from them. "I am tired. I do not want to fight anymore. I will call the bank on Monday morning and reinstate the automatic transfers. But I expect a genuine, respectful relationship moving forward. Do you both understand me?" He nodded quickly, looking incredibly relieved. "Yes, Dad, thank you." I stepped back inside and pushed the door shut. But before the latch clicked, I heard Tiffany exhale sharply. "Thank God you convinced him," she whispered to Bradley. "We could not afford a freeze right before the asset appraisal." I froze with my hand still gripping the cold brass door handle. The heavy wooden door had not fully clicked shut into the frame, leaving a tiny sliver of open space that allowed the freezing November wind and Tiffany's hushed, urgent words to drift directly into my dark foyer. Asset appraisal. The two words hung heavily in the dead silence of my hallway, long after the thick doors of their luxury sports car slammed shut. I stood perfectly still and peered through the narrow gap in the doorway. Bradley started the engine immediately, not bothering to let the vehicle warm up. The bright, piercing headlights swept wildly across my manicured front lawn as he reversed aggressively out of my driveway, peeling down the quiet suburban street, as if he were frantically escaping a fresh crime scene. I slowly pushed the front door shut, listening carefully to the firm metallic click of the heavy deadbolt sliding securely into place. I turned around and walked slowly into my dimly lit living room, my boots padding softly against the hardwood floors. I sank deeply into the old leather recliner, facing the unlit brick fireplace. The house was completely silent, yet my mind was deafeningly loud. Asset appraisal. I repeated the phrase out loud to the empty room, tasting the bitter suspicion on my tongue. It made absolutely zero logical sense. In the world of high finance and real estate, you only order a formal documented asset appraisal when you have substantial wealth that needs to be officially valued for a major financial maneuver. People who are genuinely wealthy get asset appraisals to restructure their vast portfolios, establish complex family trust funds, or prepare for massive commercial investments. People who are drowning in consumer debt do not need an asset appraisal. I knew their actual financial situation much better than they did. Bradley and Tiffany were a walking mountain of liabilities expertly disguised in designer clothing. They did not actually own the luxury vehicles currently sitting in their heated garage. Those cars were leased under extremely strict mileage terms, and I was the one paying the premium insurance policies on both of them every single month. They did not truly own the massive Winnetka house they lived in and paraded around on social media. I had personally paid the 80% down payment in pure cash 3 years ago, which meant I held the vast majority of the equity in that property. They possessed massive rolling balances on multiple high-yield credit cards just to fund their lavish vacations to the Caribbean islands and their weekly dinners at exclusive downtown Chicago restaurants. They literally owned nothing of any substantial appraisable value. Their true net worth was entirely negative. So what assets were they planning to appraise before the end of the year? The veteran contractor in me woke up completely. When you spend 4 decades managing multi-million-dollar commercial building projects, you develop a reliable sixth sense for structural weakness. You learn how to spot the tiny, almost invisible cracks in the poured concrete long before the entire foundation collapses. Tiffany's careless whisper was a massive, jagged crack running straight up the wall of their plausible lie. I sat alone in the dim light of my living room, letting my sharp mind trace the timeline backward. I needed to connect the dots. Why would my son and daughter-in-law need to isolate me specifically on Thanksgiving Day? Why were they so incredibly desperate to prevent me from speaking casually with Tiffany's visiting parents and the rest of our extended family network? Why did they need my automatic bank payments to continue uninterrupted right before an official appraisal was conducted? Then a single sharp memory struck me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The air inside my living room seemed to instantly drop 10 degrees. It was a Tuesday afternoon exactly 3 weeks ago. I had been sitting at my kitchen table drinking a cup of black coffee and reviewing some old architectural blueprints just to keep my mind sharp. Bradley had burst through my front door without knocking, sweating profusely, despite the chilly autumn weather outside. He was wearing a tailored business suit, holding his expensive leather briefcase, and acting like a man who was running out of time. He threw a thick stack of legal documents onto my table. "Dad, I need a massive favor right now," he had said, checking his silver wristwatch frantically. "I am catching a flight to Denver for a huge corporate conference in exactly 2 hours, and I completely forgot to drop these off at my accountant's office. They are just the routine estate tax updates we talked about last month. I need your signature on the back pages so I can overnight them to the firm before the deadline. Please, Dad, just sign the highlighted tabs. I cannot miss this flight, or my boss will actually kill me." I remembered looking at my son, seeing the genuine panic and exhaustion in his eyes. I remembered the rush of paternal instinct, the deep desire to simply help my boy succeed in his high-pressure corporate career. I did not pull out my reading glasses. I did not carefully review the dense paragraphs of legal jargon printed on the thick watermarked paper. I did not question why the documents required a notary public stamp, assuming his firm would handle that technicality later. I just blindly trusted the boy I had raised. I had taken the black pen he offered me and quickly scribbled my signature on 4 separate pages exactly where the bright yellow sticky notes pointed. Bradley had snatched the papers up the very second my pen lifted from the final page. He thanked me profusely, gave me a quick, distracted hug, and sprinted back out the door to his waiting car. I had completely forgotten about that frantic, rushed interaction until this exact second. Now sitting in the dark, the memory replayed in my mind with terrifying clarity. Routine estate tax updates do not require 4 separate signatures on heavily watermarked legal paper. Routine estate tax updates do not usually induce that level of frantic, sweating panic. My breathing grew shallow as the horrible realization washed over my entire body. I had willingly handed my son my signature without reading a single word of the text. I was a man who scrutinized 50-page supplier contracts for hidden liability clauses. Yet I had allowed my own flesh and blood to bypass all my defenses simply because he called me Dad. The sickening feeling in my gut morphed into a hard, crystalline certainty. Bradley was not updating my taxes. He was manipulating my assets. That was the only logical reason a couple drowning in debt would suddenly require an urgent year-end asset appraisal. They were not appraising their non-existent wealth. They were appraising mine. My commercial real estate portfolio, my liquid investment accounts, my 80% stake in their Winnetka mansion. I stood up from the leather recliner so fast that the heavy chair rocked backward. I did not feel 70 years old in that moment. I felt like a soldier stepping onto a battlefield. I walked purposely down the long hallway toward my home office, flipping on the bright overhead lights. My office was a sanctuary of organization filled with filing cabinets, thick ledgers, and a massive mahogany desk. I walked behind the desk and looked at the digital clock glowing on my computer monitor. It was exactly 11 o'clock at night. It was late, but I did not care. When your entire life's work is potentially under siege, basic social etiquette ceases to matter. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and scrolled rapidly through my contact list until I found the name I needed. Rick Barnes. Rick was not just a lawyer. He was a legal predator. He was a ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney who had represented my construction firm for the last 25 years. He was the kind of man who enjoyed destroying opposing counsel in civil litigation cases. He charged $800 an hour, and he was worth every single penny. I pressed the green call button and lifted the phone to my ear. The line rang twice before Rick answered. His voice was gravelly and thick with sleep, clearly annoyed at the late-hour interruption. "Harrison, do you have any idea what time it is?" Rick grumbled into the phone. "This better be a literal building collapse or a federal indictment." I never apologized for waking him. I kept my voice incredibly steady, devoid of any panic or hesitation. "Rick, I need you to wake up and get to a secure computer immediately," I commanded, staring blankly at the wall of my office. 3 weeks ago, my son came to my house and had me hastily sign a stack of legal documents. "I need an emergency legal audit. Do it right now." The weekend dragged on like a slow, agonizing crawl through wet cement. I did not answer any more calls from Bradley or Tiffany. I sat in my quiet house watching the rain beat against the windows, letting the bitter reality of my situation harden into solid resolve. When Monday morning finally arrived, I drove downtown to the financial district. The sky was an unforgiving steel gray, matching the coldness that had settled deep inside my chest. I walked into the towering glass skyscraper that housed the law offices of Barnes and Associates. I did not stop at the front reception desk. I bypassed the waiting area and walked straight back to the corner suite. Rick Barnes was already waiting for me. He was sitting behind his massive dark mahogany desk, holding a thick manila folder. Rick was a man who rarely showed any emotion. He had built his reputation by being the most stoic, calculating corporate attorney in Chicago. But as I closed the heavy wooden door behind me and took a seat in the leather chair opposite his desk, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. It was genuine, unadulterated pity, and that scared me more than any legal threat ever could. Rick did not offer a polite morning greeting. He did not ask how my weekend was. He simply lifted the heavy stack of documents from the folder and dropped them onto the polished surface of his desk with a loud, definitive thud. The sound echoed in the quiet office like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. "Harrison, you have a massive problem," Rick said, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. "I spent the entire weekend tearing apart the county records and the state notary database. The documents your son had you sign 3 weeks ago were not routine estate tax updates. They were not even remotely related to your tax profile." I leaned forward, my hands resting on my knees. "Tell me exactly what I signed, Rick." He slid the first page across the desk toward me. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney, he said, pointing to my hasty scribbled signature at the bottom. "This document grants your son Bradley Cole absolute, unrestricted legal authority to act on your behalf in all financial and legal matters. He can open bank accounts. He can close bank accounts. He can buy, sell, or mortgage property in your name. He essentially owns your financial identity." I felt the air evacuate my lungs, but I forced myself to remain completely still. I stared at my own handwriting. I had signed my entire life away because my son said he was going to miss a flight. "But that is not all," Rick continued, sliding a second document across the smooth wood. "This one is an attempted quitclaim deed. It is a legal instrument designed to quickly transfer the ownership of your primary residence and your liquid investment accounts directly into a revocable trust controlled exclusively by Bradley and Tiffany." I sat back in the leather chair, feeling a dark, suffocating wave of irony wash over me. For 40 years, I navigated the brutal, unforgiving world of commercial construction in Chicago. I sat in smoke-filled rooms with ruthless union bosses who would smile at you while trying to bankrupt your company. I negotiated against cutthroat property developers who would search for any tiny loophole to void a multi-million-dollar contract. I spent decades anticipating traps, reading the fine print, and outsmarting some of the most deceitful businessmen in the city. I built an impenetrable armor against fraudsters and thieves. I never lost a single major negotiation. I never let anyone take advantage of my labor. And yet, here I was, defeated, conned, stripped of my legal autonomy. Not by a clever corporate rival, but by the very son whose elite out-of-state MBA program I had paid for in full. I had spent a fortune educating him on how to succeed in the business world, and he had turned around and used that exact education to orchestrate a hostile takeover of his own father. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal tasted like ash in my mouth. "Is the quitclaim deed active?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Have they taken my home?" Rick shook his head slightly, leaning back in his chair. "No. The quitclaim deed was rejected by the county clerk office because it lacked a secondary witness signature. Your son was apparently in too much of a rush to get the paperwork filed properly. Your primary residence and your personal investment accounts are still safe, at least for the moment. I have already filed an emergency injunction to block any further transfers regarding those specific assets." I let out a slow, measured breath. "Well, that is something. We can revoke the power of attorney today. I will sign whatever you need me to sign to terminate his access. We will lock him out, and then I will deal with him personally." I watched as Rick folded his hands together on the desk. He did not mirror my relief. He did not reach for a revocation form. Instead, he opened a second, thinner folder that was sitting next to his keyboard. "We can absolutely revoke the power of attorney today, Harrison," he said softly, his tone completely void of optimism. "And I already have the paperwork drafted to do exactly that. But revoking his authority today does not erase the actions he took yesterday or last week." I frowned, feeling that cold knot in my stomach twist violently. "What do you mean? What actions?" Rick sighed, a heavy, tired sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 ruined lives. He pulled a printed bank statement from the thin folder and pushed it slowly across the desk. The logo at the top belonged to the commercial lending division of a major national bank. "Your son did not need the quitclaim deed to go through to get what he wanted," Rick explained, pointing his expensive pen at a bolded number on the page. "The power of attorney was fully activated and accepted by the financial institutions 15 days ago. He did not touch your personal checking accounts. He did not go after your retirement funds because he knew you would notice the missing money immediately. He went after the assets you do not monitor on a daily basis. My commercial real estate portfolio." I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical punch. "Exactly," Rick confirmed grimly. "You own 5 commercial warehouse properties free and clear in the industrial district. Because they are fully paid off and generate steady rental income, they have massive equity." Bradley used the power of attorney to approach a commercial lender. He presented himself as your legally appointed financial representative managing your estate to prepare for your retirement. He used your pristine credit score and the massive equity in those 5 warehouses as collateral. I stared blindly at the black numbers. My vision was swimming. The document detailed an enormous loan secured against my entire life of work. My portfolio was fully leveraged. I froze. I stared blindly at the black numbers. My vision was swimming. The document detailed an enormous loan secured against my entire life of work. My portfolio was fully leveraged. I froze. I sat in Rick's office, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on my chest. My own son had stolen $2 million using my name and assets as collateral. Rick leaned across his desk, his voice a low rumble. He advised me to contact federal authorities immediately. He explained this was a textbook case of wire fraud and elder financial abuse. He wanted to file emergency injunctions and drag Bradley into a deposition room today. But I raised my hand, stopping him. I needed a moment to think. In commercial construction, you never tear down a load-bearing wall until you know exactly what rests on top of it. If I called the police right now, Bradley would panic. He would hire a defense attorney, claim it was a misunderstanding, and possibly drain the stolen funds before we could freeze the offshore accounts. I needed to know the full scope of his endgame. I needed to hear the truth directly from his mouth. I told Rick to hold off on the federal agents for exactly 48 hours. I told him I needed to gather my own intelligence first. I left the law firm and drove straight to an electronics store downtown. I walked down the aisles with a singular cold focus. I purchased a state-of-the-art, voice-activated micro-recording device. It was no larger than a thumb drive equipped with a lithium battery and an incredibly sensitive microphone. It was the exact equipment used by private investigators. I sat in the cab of my truck and synced the small device to a secure application on my phone. I tested the live audio feed. It was crystal clear. Now I needed a plausible reason to enter the belly of the beast. I needed a solid pretext to get inside Bradley's house without raising suspicion. I drove to a boutique toy store and purchased a complex motorized building set. It was the toy my 7-year-old grandson Leo had been begging for. This would be my Trojan horse. I would play the role of the sad, forgiving grandfather bringing an early holiday gift because I had been uninvited from the actual dinner. It was a pathetic role that made me sick to my stomach, but I knew I had to play it flawlessly. I pulled my truck onto the tree-lined street in Winnetka. The massive colonial-style mansion loomed at the end of the circular driveway. I looked at the pristine brickwork and expensive landscaping. I had paid the $2 million down payment on this property so my son could have a comfortable head start. Now it was the fortified headquarters of his fraudulent criminal operation. I parked directly behind Tiffany's luxury sports car. I took a deep breath, smoothing my expression into a mask of mild, submissive defeat. I grabbed the brightly wrapped toy from the passenger seat and walked slowly up the stone pathway. I rang the doorbell. I could hear the chaotic sounds of a household in distress echoing from inside the foyer. After a long minute, the heavy oak door swung open. Tiffany stood there looking completely frazzled. She was wearing designer activewear, holding a metal clipboard and balancing her cell phone between her shoulder and her ear. When she saw me standing on the porch, her eyes widened in brief panic. She likely remembered the intense confrontation we had just a few nights ago. But I immediately softened my posture. I offered her a gentle, weary smile. I held up the wrapped box and told her I just wanted to drop off an early Thanksgiving gift for Leo, since I would not be joining them. Tiffany visibly relaxed. The tension drained completely from her shoulders as she bought my performance. She assumed I was surrendering to their demands. She assumed the clueless old man had accepted his place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. She offered a fake, pitying smile and stepped aside to let me enter the grand foyer. She pointed toward the living room, telling me Leo was watching television before turning her attention back to her frantic phone call. She was screaming at a catering company about a mistaken order for tomorrow's massive feast. I walked into the living room and found my grandson sitting on the thick rug, staring intently at a cartoon. His bright eyes lit up the moment he saw me. I knelt down and handed him the box. He tore into the colorful wrapping paper with pure joy. I hugged him tightly, feeling a genuine ache in my heart. He was the only innocent person in this nightmare. I told him to go show his mother what he had received. As soon as the boy bounded excitedly toward the kitchen, leaving me entirely alone, my demeanor shifted instantly. I stood up. The clock was ticking. I moved silently down the carpeted hallway toward the back of the house. Bradley's home office was situated at the very end of the corridor, isolated from the noise of the main living areas. I gripped the cold brass handle and turned it slowly. The door clicked open. I slipped inside and gently pushed the door shut behind me, leaving it open just a fraction of an inch so I could hear anyone approaching. The office was a monument to unearned arrogance. It featured floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, expensive modern art, and a massive custom-built oak desk positioned squarely in the center of the room. I did not waste precious time looking through his filing cabinets or computer monitor. He would have complex passwords and digital locks. I just needed to plant the bug. I relied on 40 years of commercial construction experience to analyze the room instantly. I evaluated the acoustics of the space. Hardwood floors bounce sound waves. Heavy velvet curtains absorb them. The large glass window behind the desk would create a slight reverberation. If I placed the microphone too close to the window, the ambient vibration would muffle the recorded voices. If I placed it on the tall bookshelves, it would be too far from where the conversations happened. The optimal acoustic epicenter of the room was directly underneath the solid oak desktop. I dropped to my knees on the expensive Persian rug. I slid completely underneath the heavy desk. The underside of the wooden surface was dark and smooth. I pulled the micro-recording device from my jacket pocket. I peeled the protective film off the industrial-strength adhesive backing. I reached my arm up into the darkest, most recessed corner of the desk frame right behind the central support beam, where no one would ever accidentally brush their knee. I pressed the device firmly against the raw wood, holding it there for 10 solid seconds to ensure the adhesive bonded perfectly. I tapped the tiny activation button. A microscopic green light flashed once, indicating that the device was live, connected, and actively picking up the ambient sound in the room. I had just turned my son's private sanctuary into a live broadcasting station. I slid backward out from under the desk, brushed the invisible lint off my trousers, and stood up quickly. I took one final look around the room to ensure nothing had been disturbed. Every single pen was in its place. The leather chair was perfectly aligned. The trap was set. I reached for the door handle. Just as my fingers brushed the brass, the heavy front door slammed shut. I heard Bradley's footsteps echoing aggressively on the hardwood floor. He was walking directly toward the office corridor. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. I could not be caught sneaking out of his workspace. I quickly opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, pulling it shut behind me just as Bradley rounded the corner. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes narrowing with immediate suspicion. He looked at me, then looked at the closed office door. He demanded to know what I was doing lurking in the back hallway. I did not flinch. I let my shoulders slump forward, putting on the face of a tired, forgetful senior citizen. I offered him a weak, apologetic smile. I told him I was just looking for the guest bathroom, playing the part of a confused old man who had simply taken a wrong turn. I patted him gently on the shoulder, told him I loved him, and said I hoped he had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I walked past him, heading toward the front door. I stepped out into the crisp autumn air and walked to my truck. I climbed into the driver's seat and pulled out my phone. I opened the secure application. The audio feed was crystal clear. I could hear Bradley breathing as he settled into his desk chair. I smiled. The demolition was about to begin. The drive from Winnetka back to the heart of downtown Chicago felt remarkably short. My mind was completely detached from the traffic around me. I was running on the pure, calculated adrenaline that only a man preparing for war can feel. I parked my truck in the underground garage of the towering glass building and took the private elevator straight up to the top floor. Rick Barnes had instructed me to return to his office as soon as my task was complete. When the heavy elevator doors slid open, Rick was waiting for me in the main corridor. He did not say a word. He simply gestured for me to follow him into the large, soundproof executive conference room situated at the end of the hall. Inside the conference room, the blinds were drawn, and the long mahogany table was covered in neat stacks of financial documents. A younger man wearing a sharp gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses was typing rapidly on a high-end laptop. Rick closed the door firmly behind us and gestured toward the young man. He introduced him as David, a senior forensic accountant, who frequently partnered with the firm on complex corporate embezzlement cases. David did not look up from his screen as he offered a brief professional greeting. He possessed the intense, focused demeanor of someone who dealt exclusively with numbers, patterns, and financial discrepancies. I took a seat at the head of the long table, resting my hands flat on the polished wood. I told them the listening device was successfully planted and currently active. Rick nodded in approval, but his expression remained gravely serious. He pulled out a leather chair and sat down next to me. He folded his hands together and leaned forward. He told me that while I was busy in the suburbs, David had been relentlessly tracking the digital footprint of the power of attorney document my son had filed. I braced myself. In construction, you always prepare for the worst possible structural damage before you open up a wall. I told David to give me the exact numbers without any sugarcoating. David finally stopped typing. He turned his laptop screen toward me, displaying a complex, color-coded spreadsheet. He explained that Bradley had moved with terrifying speed. Utilizing the forged authorization, my son had approached a mid-tier commercial lender who specialized in rapid high-value equity loans. Bradley had presented them with the deeds to my 5 fully owned industrial warehouses. Because those properties were entirely free of any existing mortgages and generated substantial, verifiable monthly income, the bank did not flag the transaction. Bradley had successfully collateralized my life's work to secure a massive commercial line of credit. The total amount approved was a staggering $2 million. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the theft. $2 million. That was not just a lapse in judgment. That was not a simple mistake made by a desperate man trying to pay off some overdue credit card bills. That was a calculated, enormous financial extraction. I asked David if Bradley had transferred the funds into his own personal checking account. I assumed my son was simply trying to clear his extravagant debts, or perhaps purchase another luxury property to satisfy Tiffany's endless desire for high society status. But David shook his head firmly. He tapped a specific row on the spreadsheet highlighting a massive outbound transaction. David explained that the $2 million never actually settled into any account controlled by Bradley or Tiffany. The moment the commercial lender released the funds, the entire sum was immediately wired out of the primary holding account. It was routed through a complex series of rapid digital transfers clearly designed to obscure the final destination. However, forensic accountants are trained to follow the digital breadcrumbs. David tracked the final wire transfer to a small, obscure, limited liability company registered in the state of Indiana. The company was listed under a highly generic name, suggesting it was nothing more than a newly formed corporate shell. I leaned forward, my brow furrowing in deep concentration. I asked who owned the shell company. David quickly pulled up a secondary document displaying a recently obtained corporate registry filing from the Indiana Secretary of State. He pointed to the single name listed under the Managing Director section. Derek Lawson. The name echoed in the quiet conference room. Derek Lawson was Tiffany's older brother. He was a man I had only met a handful of times, a smooth-talking, unreliable entrepreneur who was perpetually launching new business ventures that constantly teetered on the very edge of total bankruptcy. The pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together in my mind. Tiffany's panicked slip of the tongue in my driveway finally made complete, terrifying sense. They were not conducting an asset appraisal to manage their own wealth. They needed the appraisal to finalize the $2 million commercial line of credit against my warehouses. They had orchestrated this entire elaborate scheme to bail out her brother's failing business empire. Bradley had effectively stolen $2 million of my hard-earned money and handed it directly to his wife's brother across state lines. He had jeopardized everything I had built to fund a reckless, doomed enterprise. Rick leaned back in his leather chair, a cold, predatory smile slowly forming on his face. He told me that this changed everything. If Bradley had simply transferred the money to himself within the state, it would be a severe case of elder financial abuse and civil fraud. But by wiring the stolen funds across state lines to a separate corporate entity, he had crossed a massive legal threshold. Rick explained that this was a textbook violation of federal law. It was an interstate wire fraud conspiracy compounded by money laundering, since they utilized a shell company to receive the illicit funds. The severity of the situation settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. My own son had committed a federal crime. If the authorities discovered this transaction independently, the federal government could freeze my commercial properties indefinitely, treating them as assets tied to an active criminal investigation. I would be forced to spend years in grueling litigation just to prove my innocence and reclaim the warehouses I had owned for decades. Bradley had not just stolen from me. He had placed my entire financial legacy in the direct crosshairs of federal prosecutors. I felt a deep, profound sadness mingle with my rising fury. I asked Rick what our immediate strategy should be. I wanted to know how to surgically dismantle their operation without accidentally detonating my own portfolio. Rick outlined the plan with chilling precision. He would immediately contact a specialized associate within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, someone who handled high-level white-collar crime and corporate fraud. We would present the evidence voluntarily, demonstrating that I was the victim of a complex conspiracy. By coming forward first, we would secure my assets and ensure the federal hammer fell exclusively on Bradley, Tiffany, and Derek. Before Rick could finish explaining the logistical details of the federal reporting process, my cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany table. The sudden buzzing sound shattered the quiet atmosphere of the conference room. I glanced down at the illuminated screen. It was a push notification from the secure audio application I had installed earlier. The micro-recording device I had planted underneath Bradley's oak desk was detecting significant elevated noise levels. The application alert simply read, "Audio spike detected." I reached out and unlocked the phone, my thumb hovering over the active broadcast button. I looked up at Rick and David. I told them that the listening device was active and that my son and daughter-in-law were currently in the home office. I pressed the small speaker icon on my screen, broadcasting the live audio feed into the center of the silent room. The connection hissed with a brief burst of static before the clear sound of shouting filled the space. It was not a simple disagreement. It was a frantic, terrifying argument. Tiffany was screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice shrill and laced with undeniable panic. Bradley's voice boomed through the tiny speaker, attempting to talk over her frantic wailing. He sounded furious, pacing heavily back and forth across the hardwood floor. The microphone caught the distinct sound of a glass object shattering violently against a wall. The sheer volume and intensity of their conflict indicated that something massive had just shifted in their timeline. They were no longer simply arguing about my canceled automatic payments. They were discussing the next phase of their horrifying scheme. I leaned closer to the phone, my heart pounding in my chest, listening to the very monsters I had allowed into my life. The demolition had moved past the planning phase. The wrecking ball was swinging. It was unstoppable. They were destroying themselves, and I was listening. I stood up from the mahogany conference table, telling Rick and David that I needed absolute privacy for this. I walked out of the glass building and retreated to the isolated sanctuary of my parked truck. I sat in the driver's seat, completely enveloped by the heavy darkness of the November night. The engine was off, leaving the cabin freezing and entirely silent. My hands trembled slightly, not from the cold seeping through the windows, but from the adrenaline flooding my veins. I reached up and pulled my Bluetooth headset from the visor, pressing the small earbud firmly into my right ear. The connection chimed softly, pairing with the secure application on my phone. I stared at the illuminated screen, watching the digital audio waves spike and fall in rhythmic green patterns. The recording device I planted underneath the oak desk was performing flawlessly. It picked up every ambient sound in the room with terrifying clarity. I could hear the heavy thud of Bradley pacing aggressively across the hardwood floor. I could hear the sharp, frantic clicking of Tiffany and her designer heels as she followed closely behind him. They had locked themselves securely inside the home office. Now there was only the sharp, venomous tension radiating between my son and his wife. I closed my eyes, gripped the leather steering wheel, and braced myself for the impact. The audio feed crackled for a fraction of a second before the shrill voice pierced directly into the ear. She was no longer playing the part of the distressed, overwhelmed hostess. Her tone was vicious, dripping with an absolute unadulterated contempt that made my stomach turn. She was furious that I had shown up unannounced, bringing a simple toy for my beautiful grandson this very morning. "He has absolutely no right to just walk into our house like he owns the place," Tiffany hissed, her voice vibrating with pure rage. I could hear the distinct sound of her slamming the heavy metal clipboard onto the desk. He stood there, smiling at Leo, acting like the perfect, loving grandfather, while he is actively trying to ruin our entire lives. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to stand in the foyer and pretend to be grateful for a cheap plastic building set? I am dealing with caterers who cannot tell the difference between vegan and gluten-free. My parents are arriving tomorrow, expecting a flawless holiday, and your father just casually drops by to assert his dominance. He is trying to intimidate us, Bradley. He is testing the waters to see if we are going to crack. I sat in my frozen truck listening to the woman I had welcomed into my family tear my character to shreds. For years, I had treated Tiffany like my own daughter. I had paid for her extravagant wedding, funded her lavish country club memberships, and bailed them out of every minor financial inconvenience they ever encountered. Hearing the raw, venomous hatred in her voice was like stepping on a hidden landmine. But I did not feel any sorrow. I only felt a cold, calculating detachment. I needed her to keep talking. I needed them to expose the absolute bottom of their depravity. Bradley let out a long, frustrated groan. The microphone picked up the sound of him collapsing heavily into his leather desk chair. The thick wooden frame groaned under his weight, positioning him mere inches away from the hidden recording device. His voice came through the speaker with startling proximity. "You need to calm down and lower your voice," Bradley ordered, his tone laced with exhaustion and rising panic. He does not know anything about our actual situation. He is just acting stubborn because I confronted him on the porch last week about the automatic bank transfers. He is playing his usual power games, trying to remind us that he controls the purse strings. We just need to keep him isolated and completely in the dark for a few more weeks. Once the holiday weekend is over, we will initiate the final phase and his petty little power trips will not matter anymore. Tiffany let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly through my earpiece. "A few more weeks," she repeated, her voice rising in pitch again. "We do not have a few more weeks, Bradley. Have you completely lost your mind? Derek called me 3 times this morning while you were in your virtual meetings. He is completely panicking. The $2 million you pulled from the commercial portfolio of your father was just a temporary bandage. It stopped the immediate bleeding, but the creditors are circling Derek like vultures. He missed another major payroll cycle for his logistics company. If he does not get the remaining capital injected into his holding accounts, by next week the federal regulators are going to start freezing his corporate assets. If they freeze his accounts, they are going to audit the origin of the initial $2 million. And if they trace that wire transfer back to you, we are all going to federal prison. We cannot wait a few more weeks. We need the rest of the capital right now. Is the doctor report ready?" My blood ran completely cold. The $2 million was just phase 1. They had always intended to drain every single asset I possessed. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling a physical wave of nausea wash over me as the full scope of their greed materialized. They were using my entire life of work, the fortune I built, with my own blood and sweat, to single-handedly float the collapsing business empire of her brother. Bradley let out another heavy sigh, the sound of a man crumbling under the weight of his own massive deception. "I am handling the doctor. Tiffany." He snapped, his voice rough and defensive. "These things take a very specific type of finesse. You cannot just demand falsified medical documents overnight. The specialist I found is incredibly expensive, and he is demanding an extra $100,000 in clean cash to finalize the specific wording we need for the legal filings. I told him we would have the money for him immediately after the holiday weekend. He is reviewing the preliminary paperwork today. Once he signs the official affidavit, the entire legal pathway is completely cleared. We will have absolute unrestricted access to the liquid investment accounts, and we can finally cash out the remaining equity in the Winnetka property without needing a secondary witness signature from my father. We just need to survive Thanksgiving without raising any red flags. If my dad gets suspicious and contacts his own lawyers before the medical affidavit is officially filed with the state courts, our entire plan goes up in smoke. We have to keep him perfectly calm and happy until Friday morning." Tiffany scoffed loudly, the sound vibrating harshly in my ear. "Keep him perfectly calm and happy," she mocked bitterly. "He is already suspicious, Bradley. He is acting strange. He stood in our living room today looking at me like he knew something was wrong. I cannot keep playing the loving daughter-in-law while my brother is facing complete financial ruin. You need to expedite the legal timeline. I do not care how much extra cash the specialist demands. Give it to him. Tell him to backdate the evaluation if he has to. We need the absolute legal authority to liquidate his remaining portfolios before he decides to suddenly review his own bank statements. Tell me exactly what the timeline is right now. Tell me we are almost finished with this miserable charade. I sat in the darkness, my breathing perfectly shallow, waiting for my son to seal his own fate. The microphone picked up the sound of Bradley shifting his weight in the leather chair, leaning forward until his voice was terrifyingly close to the hidden transmitter. "The falsified dementia evaluation is done," Bradley said, his voice dropping to a cold, clinical whisper that froze the very marrow in my bones. "I am picking up the physical documents on Wednesday afternoon. We file the emergency petition for full conservatorship the day after Thanksgiving. The judge will grant the temporary order based on the medical severity outlined in the affidavit. He will be legally declared unfit to manage his own estate. He will be locked in a private care facility by the first week of December, and we take complete control of the estate." I pulled the earpiece from my head, letting it fall softly onto the passenger seat. The sheer calculated evil of their plot completely suffocated the air inside my vehicle. They did not just want to steal my wealth and commercial properties. They truly intended to permanently erase my freedom and lock me away forever. I started the engine, staring blankly at their beautifully illuminated house. The quiet game of patience was officially over tonight. It was finally time to strike. I sat in the freezing cab of my truck, staring blindly at the pristine brick facade of the Winnetka mansion. The digital display on my dashboard glowed with a pale, indifferent light, illuminating the cold truth that had just fractured my entire existence. The audio feed was completely silent now, but the horrifying words my son had spoken continued to echo endlessly inside my skull. Falsified dementia evaluation. Emergency petition for full conservatorship. Locked in a private care facility by December. I placed my calloused hands on the leather steering wheel and gripped it until my knuckles turned stark white. For a brief agonizing moment, a profound and suffocating wave of grief washed over me. It was a physical blow, a sudden heavy pressure centered directly in my chest that stole the breath from my lungs. I mourned the boy I had raised. I thought of the countless hours I spent teaching him how to ride a bicycle, the immense pride I felt watching him walk across the graduation stage to receive his elite business degree, the genuine joy of holding my grandson in my arms. I had given Bradley everything. I had poured my entire life into building a foundation so solid that he would never have to experience the bitter taste of poverty or the brutal, backbreaking exhaustion of manual labor. I remembered the brutal Chicago winters, where I risked my own life on icy scaffolding just to ensure his college tuition was paid in full. I had sacrificed my own physical health so he could sit in air-conditioned classrooms and learn how to manipulate spreadsheets. It was a sick, twisted joke. And his gratitude, his ultimate repayment for a lifetime of unconditional paternal love, was an intricately designed plot to declare me mentally incompetent, steal my fortune, and lock me away in a sterile room to wait for death. The sheer depravity of his betrayal was staggering, but the grief did not last. It could not last. In the brutal world of commercial construction, if you allow a sudden collapse to paralyze you with sorrow, the falling debris will absolutely crush you. You have to compartmentalize the damage instantly. You have to analyze the structural failure and immediately pivot to a strategy of sheer survival. As I sat in the darkness, I felt the last lingering threads of my paternal sympathy snap and dissolve into nothingness. The forgiving, generous father, who wanted nothing more than a peaceful Thanksgiving dinner, died in that freezing truck. In his place, the ruthless, battle-hardened commercial contractor resurrected. I was a man who had spent 4 decades crushing cutthroat property developers and dismantling corrupt union bosses. I knew exactly how to wage a war of attrition, and I knew how to win. I shifted the truck into gear and drove away from the mansion, my mind locked into a state of pure, terrifying clarity. I navigated the dark suburban streets and merged onto the highway, heading straight back to the downtown financial district. I drove past the glittering storefronts of the Magnificent Mile, feeling utterly detached from the world around me. The empty streets were slick with a fresh layer of freezing rain, reflecting the stark, unforgiving neon lights of the towering financial institutions. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a sprawling grid of illuminated skyscrapers that mirrored the complex, intricate battle plan forming in my head. I arrived back at the corporate law firm shortly after midnight. The heavy glass doors of the towering building were locked, but Rick Barnes had left explicit instructions with the night security guard to allow me immediate entry. I rode the private elevator back up to the executive suite. Rick and David were still sitting inside the soundproof conference room, surrounded by the towering stacks of financial documents and legal ledgers. They looked up as I entered, clearly exhausted, but highly alert. I did not bother with any pleasantries. I walked straight to the mahogany table, pulled my cell phone from my pocket, and placed it directly in the center of the polished wood. I synced the audio files I had just captured and pressed play. I stood silently near the large glass window, looking out over the sleeping city as the recorded voices of Bradley and Tiffany filled the room. I watched the expressions on the faces of my legal team change from professional concern to absolute, unadulterated horror. When the recording finally reached the chilling moment where Bradley detailed the purchased medical affidavit and the looming conservatorship, David slowly closed his laptop screen. Rick took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, ragged breath. He looked at me with a profound, newfound respect mixed with genuine dread. "Harrison Rick," said, his voice unusually hushed and grave, "I have prosecuted corporate embezzlement cases for over 25 years, but the sheer calculated malice of this operation is entirely unprecedented. This is no longer just a civil dispute over a forged power of attorney or a mismanaged commercial loan. What we are looking at is a massive, multi-layered criminal conspiracy." Rick stood up and began pacing the length of the conference room, his sharp legal mind dissecting the audio recording with surgical precision. "By utilizing your forged signature to extract a $2 million commercial line of credit, your son committed bank fraud. By immediately transferring those illicit funds across state lines to a limited liability company registered in Indiana, he and his brother-in-law have triggered a textbook federal wire fraud and money laundering scheme. And by actively purchasing a falsified medical document to fraudulently strip you of your legal autonomy, they have escalated this into severe, actionable elder abuse and medical fraud. Because the stolen capital crossed state borders and landed in a separate jurisdiction, this officially transcends local law enforcement. This is a federal matter under the direct, uncompromising jurisdiction of the United States government. This means the FBI, the IRS, and the Department of Justice will all have simultaneous jurisdiction over his immediate financial actions." I walked back to the table and took my seat. I reached into my thick leather portfolio, the one I had carried with me since the terrible realization first struck me earlier tonight. I pulled out a heavy notarized document and placed it squarely in front of Rick. It was the original certified property deed to the Winnetka mansion. I tapped my index finger against the bottom of the page where the ownership percentages were clearly delineated in bold black ink. I reminded Rick that despite my son parading around as the master of his domain, I still legally owned 80% of that luxury estate. I had paid the vast majority of the down payment in pure, untraceable cash. Bradley and Tiffany only held a fragile 20% equity stake, which was entirely contingent on their ability to maintain the primary mortgage. I had never truly trusted Tiffany, and I had insisted on maintaining the majority ownership strictly as a failsafe against potential divorce proceedings. I never imagined I would need to use it against my own son, to prevent my own unlawful institutionalization. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm. "I want you to draft the necessary eviction notices tonight, Rick," I instructed, staring directly into his calculating eyes. Bradley used my stolen commercial funds to finance his lifestyle and bail out Derek. That means every single financial transaction tied to his name is now legally compromised, including his portion of the residential mortgage. I want you to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings based on fraudulent financing. They wanted to steal my home and lock me in a medical facility. I am going to legally rip the roof off their house and leave them standing in the freezing snow. I want every single asset frozen. I want their credit cards locked. I want their bank accounts suspended pending federal review. I want them to wake up tomorrow morning completely destitute. Rick looked down at the original property deed, tracing the embossed notary seal with his thumb. A sharp, predatory smile slowly stretched across his face. He understood exactly what I was building. I was not just protecting my assets. I was engineering an absolute total financial demolition. It was the exact same strategy I used to employ when a corrupt subcontractor tried to breach a commercial development contract. You do not just fire them. You dismantle their entire operation so completely that they can never work in the industry again. You leave them with absolutely nothing to build on. You remove their foundation, you sever their supply lines, and you let gravity do the rest of the work. You are the architect, Harrison Rick said, softly sliding the property deed back into the secure folder. I will have the eviction notices and the emergency injunctions drafted and ready for the courts before the sun comes up. They will not be able to buy a cup of coffee tomorrow without triggering a security alert on their financial profiles. But before we initiate the civil foreclosure, we have to formally unleash the federal dogs. We need to secure your commercial portfolio and document your cooperation before Bradley tries to file that fraudulent medical affidavit. I nodded my head in agreement. The timeline was incredibly tight. Thanksgiving was only days away, and my son believed he had the perfect trap waiting for me the morning after the holiday. He thought he was playing chess against a senile, clueless old man. He had no idea that the board had already been flipped and the pieces were moving against him. I told Rick to make the call. The corporate attorney did not hesitate. He reached across his massive mahogany desk and picked up the heavy receiver of his secure office telephone. He dialed a direct, unlisted number from memory. He placed the call on the speakerphone, allowing the dial tone to ring out clearly into the quiet conference room. It rang twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered the line. Rick leaned toward the microphone, his tone shifting into a realm of pure, uncompromising business. He announced himself and stated that he needed to speak immediately with Special Agent Miller in the White-Collar Crime Division. He declared that he possessed irrefutable recorded evidence of a massive interstate wire fraud conspiracy involving millions of dollars in stolen commercial equity, a fraudulent medical evaluation, and an imminent threat to an elderly client. The voice on the other end of the line instantly hardened, recognizing the extreme severity of the claim. The agent instructed Rick to hold the line while he patched the call through to the regional director. I looked at the glowing red button on the speakerphone, feeling a profound sense of absolute finality wash over my tired soul. The decision was entirely irreversible. I was initiating the complete destruction of my own family tree. But they had deliberately forced my hand. I would not surrender quietly. I sat back in my chair, listening to the hold music fill the room. The trap was officially armed. The 48 hours after the trap was set passed with agonizing slowness. I remained inside my house, moving through the quiet, empty rooms like a ghost haunting its own estate. I did not take my usual morning walks, nor did I venture to the local diner for black coffee. I needed to maintain the absolute illusion of a defeated, isolated old man who was quietly fading away into irrelevance. The discipline required to sit still while a wrecking ball swung toward my son was immense. I spent the time secretly securing my commercial deeds and mentally reviewing the exact timeline Rick and the agents had established. Wednesday morning arrived with a bleak, overcast sky that threatened to unleash a freezing downpour upon the Chicago suburbs. It was the day before Thanksgiving, a day traditionally dedicated to family gatherings, warm kitchens, and quiet gratitude. Instead, it was the day my son intended to pick up the fraudulent medical documents that would effectively end my freedom. I sat at my kitchen table staring down at a cold, untouched bowl of oatmeal when the sharp, sudden ringing of my cell phone shattered the heavy silence. I glanced at the glowing screen resting on the polished oak table. The caller identification displayed Bradley's name. A cold, electric jolt shot straight down my spine. The time had come to perform the most critical role of my entire life. I cleared my throat, forcing my vocal cords to relax, purposely stripping away any trace of the sharp, commanding tone I usually employed. I let my shoulders slump forward physically, adopting the posture of a weary, beaten man. I waited for the third ring before slowly dragging my finger across the glass screen to answer the call. "Hello?" I murmured into the receiver, making sure my voice sounded slightly raspy, a little disoriented, and undeniably tired. "Dad, hey, it is Bradley!" His smooth, overly cheerful voice boomed through the small speaker. "I just wanted to call and check in on you. I know things got a little heated the other night in the hallway, and I wanted to make sure you were doing okay. I wanted to make sure you were not feeling too lonely over there by yourself today." The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his words tasted like battery acid on my tongue. He was calling to verify my mental state, checking to ensure the isolated target was still sitting quietly in the snare. He needed absolute confirmation that I had not contacted any attorneys or financial advisors regarding my frozen commercial properties. I rubbed my eyes, letting a heavy, convincing sigh escape my lips. "I am fine, Bradley," I replied slowly, injecting a perfectly measured dose of confusion and exhaustion into my cadence. "I am just feeling very tired lately. My joints are aching with the cold weather, and my mind just feels a bit foggy today. I think I am just going to stay inside and rest. I have not even had the energy to check my mail or open my computer all week." I could practically hear the enormous wave of relief washing over him through the digital connection. "That is probably for the best, Dad," he said, his tone instantly shifting into a patronizing, soothing rhythm. "You have been working far too hard for way too long. You need to just rest your mind. Do not worry about any financial paperwork or those old commercial leases right now. Tiffany and I have everything completely under control. Just relax, watch some television, and take it easy. We will figure everything out after the holidays." His deliberate use of the phrase "rest your mind" was a sickening confirmation of his ultimate endgame. He was subtly laying the psychological groundwork, planting the idea that my cognitive decline was a natural, expected progression. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table until my fingers ached, but I kept my voice incredibly soft and submissive. "Thank you, Bradley," I whispered, playing the role of the grateful, compliant victim. "I suppose a quiet weekend is exactly what I need right now. I hope you and Tiffany have a wonderful Thanksgiving tomorrow. I know her parents flew in from Atlanta. What time are you all sitting down for the big dinner anyway?" I posed the question casually, masking it as the innocent curiosity of a lonely old man wishing he could be part of the festivities. Bradley did not hesitate. He felt entirely victorious, utterly convinced that he had successfully neutralized the only threat to his $2 million theft. "We are serving dinner precisely at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon," he answered confidently. "Derek is driving in from Indiana to join us, so the whole house is going to be incredibly loud and chaotic. You are honestly much better off avoiding the stress and staying comfortable in your own quiet house. We will bring you some leftover turkey and pie on Friday morning, I promise." Friday morning, the exact day they planned to file the emergency petition for conservatorship and lock me in a medical facility. They intended to bring me a plate of cold Thanksgiving leftovers while a judge signed away my fundamental human rights. "That sounds lovely, Bradley," I said, allowing a slight pathetic tremor to enter my voice. "Enjoy the meal with Derek and the family. I will just be here resting." "I love you, son." "I love you too, Dad," he replied smoothly, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Get some sleep." The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone from my ear and placed it gently back onto the wooden table. The pathetic, hunched posture of the confused senior citizen instantly vanished. I straightened my back, pulling my shoulders back until my spine cracked sharply in the quiet kitchen. The performance was over. The intelligence-gathering phase was officially complete. I now possessed the exact coordinates and the precise timeline of their holiday gathering. 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. The entire network of conspirators would be sitting securely around one massive dining room table, completely oblivious to the catastrophic storm I had engineered. Derek, the orchestrator of the failing logistics company in Indiana, would be present. Tiffany, the furious architect of my impending medical incarceration, would be hosting. And Bradley, the son who traded my legacy for a stolen commercial credit line, would be carving the turkey. It was the perfect, inescapable configuration. I walked out of the kitchen and moved deliberately down the hallway toward the master bedroom. I bypassed my usual casual clothing and walked directly to the back of my spacious walk-in closet. I reached past the flannel shirts and denim jeans to pull out a heavy protective garment bag. I unzipped the thick canvas to reveal a sharp, charcoal gray, custom-tailored suit. I had worn this exact suit to high-stakes corporate negotiations, brutal civil litigation hearings, and massive commercial contract signings. It was not just an article of clothing. It was a suit of armor designed to project absolute authority and uncompromising power. I dressed slowly, methodically, buttoning the crisp white shirt, securing the dark silk tie, and sliding my arms into the perfectly fitted jacket. I fastened my expensive silver watch around my wrist, checking the time. It was precisely noon. I had a scheduled rendezvous with Rick Barnes and the specialized federal agents at a secure location in downtown Chicago at 1 o'clock. I walked over to the cherry wood nightstand next to my perfectly made bed. I picked up a silver-framed photograph of my late wife, Martha. She looked beautiful, capturing a moment of pure joy from our 30th wedding anniversary. She had always been the gentle, forgiving soul of our family, the one who constantly smoothed over Bradley's selfish mistakes and pleaded for my unending patience. I stared into her smiling eyes, feeling a profound, heavy sorrow anchor my heart. "I am so sorry." "Martha," I whispered to the silent room, tracing the edge of the silver frame with my thumb. "I tried to build a legacy for him. I truly did. But the man he has become is a monster, and I cannot allow him to survive this." I paused, thinking of the bright, innocent eyes of the little boy sitting on the rug yesterday. "But I promise you, I will protect Leo from the wreckage. I will shield our grandson from the fire." I placed the silver frame gently back onto the nightstand. I turned away from the memories of the past and walked purposefully toward the front door. I grabbed my keys from the small bronze hook mounted by the heavy wooden door. I stepped outside into the freezing November air, locking the solid deadbolt securely behind me. I walked down the concrete driveway and climbed into the driver's seat of my truck. The powerful engine roared to life, vibrating intensely beneath my hands. I was entirely ready to end this madness once and for all. I met Rick Barnes and the 2 federal agents precisely at 1 o'clock in an unmarked gray sedan parked in a secure underground garage. The agents were stone-faced professionals who dealt exclusively with massive financial crimes. They had spent the last 12 hours reviewing the bank transfers, the fraudulent commercial leverage documents, and the horrifying audio recording I had captured. They possessed a mountain of probable cause, and they were fully authorized to dismantle the operation. We finalized the tactical approach in complete silence. There was no need for dramatic speeches. We all knew exactly what was about to happen. At 2:30 in the afternoon, we drove out to Winnetka in a small coordinated convoy. My heavy truck led the way, followed closely by Rick in his sleek black sedan, and the 2 plainclothes agents in their unmarked vehicle. The sky remained dark and heavy with the threat of snow, but my mind was completely clear. I turned onto the familiar, tree-lined street and pulled up to the massive colonial estate. The long circular driveway was absolutely packed with high-end luxury vehicles bearing license plates from Illinois and Indiana. Tiffany's extended family had arrived in full force, eager to celebrate a holiday funded entirely by stolen wealth. I parked my truck directly behind a gleaming silver Mercedes that likely belonged to Derek. I stepped out into the freezing air, feeling the sharp wind bite at my face. I adjusted the lapels of my custom-tailored suit, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of my leather briefcase hanging from my right hand. Rick stepped up beside me, holding his own stack of legal folders. The two federal agents flanked us silently, their badges concealed, but their authority radiating in every single measured step. We walked up the pristine stone pathway together. I did not bother to ring the doorbell. I still legally owned 80% of this magnificent property, and I still possessed the brass key they had given me 3 years ago when I paid their down payment in pure cash. I slid the key into the heavy deadbolt and turned it with a sharp metallic click. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing the grand foyer. The air inside was thick with the rich, savory smell of roasted turkey, expensive sage stuffing, and warm butter. It was the smell of a perfect traditional Thanksgiving. But beneath that wholesome aroma, I could detect the distinct scent of pure, unadulterated greed. From the formal dining room down the hall, a chorus of loud, arrogant laughter erupted. I could hear the sharp, crystalline clinking of expensive wine glasses being enthusiastically toasted. I heard the booming, overconfident voice of Derek Lawson, regaling the table with some fabricated story about his brilliant logistics company, the very company my commercial warehouses were currently bleeding to keep afloat. I felt my jaw tighten, but I did not let my anger show. I maintained my cold, calculating composure. I led our small, highly intimidating procession slowly down the wide hardwood hallway. My polished leather shoes made no sound on the thick, expensive runner rugs. We stopped just outside the wide, arched entrance to the formal dining room. I stood perfectly still, taking a moment to survey the sickening scene unfolding right in front of me. The long, polished mahogany dining table was a masterpiece of pretentious excess. It was covered in a pristine white linen tablecloth, decorated with massive, towering centerpieces of imported autumn flowers and set with shining silver cutlery. At least 20 people were seated comfortably around the feast. Tiffany was sitting near the head of the table wearing a stunning silk dress, glowing with the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had successfully pulled off the ultimate heist. Bradley was standing at the far end of the table holding an electric carving knife, preparing to slice into a massive, perfectly browned turkey. Derek sat directly across from Tiffany, holding a glass of deep red wine, his face flushed with loud, arrogant amusement. They were living an absolute lie, celebrating their fraudulent prosperity, while actively planning to lock the architect of their wealth inside a sterile medical ward. I took a deep, steadying breath and stepped directly into the center of the arched doorway. Rick Barnes stepped to my left, his face an emotionless mask of legal authority. The two federal agents stepped to my right, standing tall, their hands resting casually near their belts. I did not say a word. I simply stood there, projecting the absolute uncompromising power of a man who has arrived to reclaim his stolen kingdom. It took exactly 4 seconds for the lively atmosphere to completely shatter. A much younger cousin sitting near the doorway noticed us first. Her laughter abruptly died in her throat, her eyes widening in profound confusion. The silence spread rapidly down the long table like a fast-moving contagion. One by one, the guests stopped talking, turning their heads to stare at the 4 imposing men blocking the exit. Derek lowered his wine glass, his arrogant smile melting into a nervous, uncertain frown. Bradley froze with the electric carving knife, hovering right above the roasted turkey, the loud buzzing of the motor suddenly sounding deafening in the dead quiet room. He stared at me, his face draining of all color, instantly recognizing that the confused, tired old man he spoke to on the phone just yesterday was completely gone. In my place stood the ruthless commercial contractor he had foolishly decided to betray. Tiffany turned her head, following her husband's terrified gaze. When her eyes locked onto mine, she physically recoiled. Her manicured fingers spasmed, losing their delicate grip on her expensive crystal wine glass. The glass slipped from her hand and plummeted toward the floor. It hit the hardwood with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. Dark red wine splattered across the pristine white baseboards, looking exactly like fresh blood. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence in the dining room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. I let my cold gaze slowly sweep across the faces of the stunned guests, lingering deliberately on Derek before finally locking onto my pale, trembling son. I broke the silence, my voice booming through the room with a deep, resonant authority that commanded absolute attention. "Beautiful table you have here today," I remarked loudly, my words slicing through the tense air like a sharpened blade. "It is truly a spectacular feast, bought and paid for entirely by the sweat of a man you just tried to lock in a psychiatric asylum." Gasps of shock erupted from the extended family members. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging bewildered, frantic glances. Tiffany clamped her hands over her mouth, her face turning a sickly shade of ash gray. Bradley dropped the carving knife onto the silver platter with a loud clatter. Pure, unadulterated panic completely hijacked his features. He scrambled hastily out from behind the head of the table, nearly knocking over his heavy wooden chair in his frantic rush. He sprinted toward the doorway, raising his hands in a desperate, placating gesture, completely desperate to contain the massive explosion I had just detonated in the middle of his perfect holiday facade. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Bradley hissed, grabbing my shoulder and attempting to physically spin me around. "Please step out into the hallway with me right now. You are causing a massive scene in front of Tiffany's entire family. You are deeply confused, and we just need to talk about this in private." I did not budge a single inch from my spot. I planted my heavy boots firmly on the smooth hardwood floor, transforming my body into an immovable concrete pillar. I swatted his hand off my shoulder with a sharp, violent motion, rejecting his fake concern with absolute disgust. "I will not step into the hallway, Bradley," I stated loudly, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear me perfectly. "And I am definitely not remotely confused about anything today. I know exactly what you did with the commercial line of credit. I know exactly where you wired the $2 million. And I know exactly what you and Tiffany were planning to file in court tomorrow morning." Bradley physically stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single coherent sound. His eyes darted frantically toward Rick, and the two silent agents standing beside me finally realizing that this was not a simple family dispute. I lifted my heavy leather briefcase, placed it flatly onto the edge of the polished dining table, and snapped the golden latches open with a sharp, resounding click. I reached inside and pulled out a massive, thick stack of legal folders containing the eviction notices, the foreclosure documents, and the damning wire fraud evidence. I held them up incredibly high in the dead quiet room for everyone to clearly see the absolute truth today. I held them up incredibly high in the dead quiet room for everyone to clearly see the absolute truth today. The thick manila folders felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the undeniable proof of my son's ultimate betrayal. I did not break eye contact with Bradley as I let the folders drop from my elevated grasp. They hit the polished mahogany table with a resounding, heavy slap that made several guests physically jump in their seats. The impact sent a slight vibration through the expensive silverware and caused the water in the crystal goblets to tremble. I reached out and opened the topmost folder. I pulled out a single neatly printed document bearing the official letterhead of an expensive out-of-state psychiatric specialist. "This," I announced, my voice echoing off the high ceilings of the dining room, "is a highly detailed, entirely fabricated medical evaluation. According to this expensive piece of fiction purchased with stolen funds just 48 hours ago, I am currently suffering from advanced, rapidly deteriorating dementia." I paused, letting the severe clinical diagnosis hang in the stagnant air. The guests stared at me in absolute paralyzed horror. "According to my loving son and daughter-in-law, I am entirely incapable of managing my own basic needs, let alone my commercial real estate portfolio. I stepped forward, walking slowly down the length of the table until I was standing directly next to the massive roasted turkey Bradley had been preparing to carve. I tossed the falsified medical affidavit onto the silver serving platter. The crisp white paper landed squarely against the perfectly browned skin of the holiday bird, instantly soaking up the warm, savory juices. This document was the centerpiece of their holiday weekend. I continued, pointing a steady finger at the grease-stained paper. Tomorrow morning, while you were all eating leftover pie and watching football, Bradley and Tiffany were scheduled to file an emergency petition in state court for full legal conservatorship over my life. They were going to use this purchased lie to permanently strip away my civil rights, seize total control of my financial estate, and have me physically locked away in a secure private care facility by the first week of December. A collective gasp rippled through the stunned audience. An older woman sitting near the window covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. Tiffany squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head back and forth, as if trying to physically deny the reality of the situation. Bradley looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, his arrogant corporate posture completely collapsing into a hollow, trembling shell. He raised his hands again, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic pleading. "Dad, please stop," Bradley begged, his eyes darting frantically between me and the two silent federal agents standing by the entrance. "You do not understand the pressure we were under. We were drowning. We just needed temporary control of the assets to fix a massive problem. We were never going to actually put you in a facility. We just needed the legal leverage to handle the banks. It was just a temporary legal maneuver." Before I could verbally dissect his pathetic, groveling excuse, a sharp, angry voice interrupted from the far side of the table. Tiffany's father, a tall, imposing man wearing a tight cashmere sweater, stood up abruptly. His face was flushed red with defensive indignation. He pointed a stern finger directly at me, clearly accustomed to bullying his way through uncomfortable family situations. "Now you listen here, Harrison," her father demanded, his voice booming with misplaced authority. "I do not know what kind of paranoid delusion you are currently experiencing, but you are not going to stand in my daughter's home and accuse her of staging a medical kidnapping. Tiffany is a wonderful, caring mother and a devoted wife. If Bradley made a poor financial decision, that is an issue between you and your son. Do not drag my daughter into your toxic family drama. You are ruining a sacred holiday gathering with these wild, unsubstantiated conspiracy theories." I turned my head slowly, locking my cold gaze onto the angry man. I did not raise my voice to match his shouting. I let my tone drop into a quiet, menacing register that instantly commanded absolute silence. "This is not your daughter's home," I stated plainly, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "I paid the $2 million down payment on this property in pure cash. I hold the 80% equity stake on the primary deed. Your daughter is merely a heavily subsidized tenant living in a luxury fantasy I financed. And as for dragging her into my family drama, I am afraid she is the primary architect of this entire criminal enterprise." I reached back into the open folder resting on the table and pulled out the thick stack of bank transaction records. I held up the pages highlighting the massive wire transfer with a thick black marker. "Let us talk about that poor financial decision you just mentioned," I said, turning my attention away from the father and locking eyes directly with Derek, who was practically sinking into his velvet dining chair. 2 weeks ago, Bradley used a forged, broad-sweeping power of attorney to illegally collateralize 5 of my commercial industrial warehouses. He leveraged my pristine credit and my life savings to extract a massive $2 million commercial line of credit from a mid-tier lending institution. Derek visibly swallowed hard, his arrogant, flushed face suddenly draining of all color. He looked down at his lap, unable to meet the horrified stares of his own extended family. The tension in the room ratcheted up to an unbearable, suffocating level. But my son did not keep that stolen money. I continued, my voice ringing out like a judge reading a final, unappealable verdict. He did not pay off his massive credit card debts. He did not put it into a savings account for my grandson. The very second the bank released the $2 million, Bradley immediately wired the entire sum out of his primary holding account. He routed the stolen capital across state lines, sending it directly into an obscure generic limited liability company registered in the state of Indiana. I paused, letting the geographical detail sink into the minds of the silent audience. I looked directly at Tiffany's father, whose hand was still hovering in the air mid-point. I watched the angry indignation on his face slowly morph into a dawning, terrible comprehension. A quick search of this corporate registry database in Indiana reveals exactly who owns that newly formed shell company, I announced, dropping the bank records onto the mahogany table next to the ruined medical affidavit. The managing director of that specific LLC is sitting right there at this table. The $2 million went directly to Derek to bail out his failing debt-ridden logistics business. The dining room absolutely erupted. Tiffany's mother let out a sharp, devastated wail, clutching her chest as she looked at her son in pure disbelief. Derek pushed his chair back violently, standing up with a defensive, aggressive posture. He looked at Bradley, his eyes wide with desperate betrayal. "You told me the money was a legitimate family loan," Derek shouted across the table, pointing a shaking finger at Bradley. "You told me Harrison authorized the equity pull to help me out of a cash flow crisis. You swore the funds were clean. You told me everything was cleared through your legal department." Bradley did not even look at his brother-in-law. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the hardwood floor, his shoulders trembling with the undeniable weight of his own destruction. Tiffany finally broke her paralyzed silence, launching into a hysterical, defensive tirade. She pointed at Derek, her voice shrill and panicked. "Do not play the victim now, Derek," she screamed, tears streaming down her pale, terrified face. "You knew exactly where that capital was coming from. You called me every single day, begging for a lifeline. You told me the federal regulators were going to seize your entire company if you did not clear that remaining $1 million deficit by next week. We risked everything to save you." I stood at the head of the ruined table watching the beautiful, wealthy family completely tear each other apart. The loyalty they had pretended to share was nothing more than a fragile alliance built on stolen wealth and mutual desperation. The moment the foundation cracked, they instantly turned on one another, like cornered animals. It was exactly as Rick Barnes had predicted. You do not just fire a corrupt subcontractor. You dismantle their supply lines and let their own internal greed handle the final demolition. I stepped back physically, separating myself from the chaotic, screaming spectacle. I had said everything I came to say. I had looked my son in the eye and delivered the absolute truth. The war of words was officially over. It was time for the actual, tangible consequences to begin. I gave a brief, subtle nod to Rick Barnes. He immediately stepped back, allowing the two silent federal agents to move to the forefront. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man wearing a dark charcoal suit, stepped directly into the dining room. He did not shout over the chaotic arguing. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a gold FBI shield, holding it up for the entire room to see. The sheer authority of the badge instantly silenced the shouting match. The room fell into a deathly, terrifying quiet once more. The agent walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, stopping directly behind Tiffany's chair. He looked down at the pale, trembling woman, his expression a mask of professional, uncompromising detachment. He did not offer any comfort or polite pleasantries. He delivered the final devastating blow with cold, administrative precision. "Ma'am," the agent stated, his voice calm and entirely devoid of emotion. "Your brother Derek was arrested by our field operatives in Indianapolis exactly 1 hour ago. He was taken into federal custody for his direct involvement in an interstate wire fraud conspiracy and massive money laundering scheme." Tiffany gasped, her hands flying up to cover her face as she let out a broken, terrified sob. The agent did not pause to allow the family to process the shocking revelation. He turned his head slowly, locking his intense professional gaze onto Bradley, who was now leaning heavily against the dining room wall, looking completely pale and physically sick. The agent took a purposeful step toward my son, reaching a hand toward his belt. "We have a federal warrant to secure this location," the agent announced. Clearly, his voice carrying the inescapable weight of the United States government. "We need a word with your husband." The air in the room grew heavy and stagnant, saturated with the frantic energy of a collapsing empire. Tiffany had fallen silent, her earlier vitriol replaced by a hollow, vacant stare as the reality of the federal intervention shattered her defenses. She seemed physically smaller, dwarfed by the sheer gravity of the moment. Beside her, Bradley had hit a wall of absolute psychological paralysis. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving in shallow, jagged gasps, while he clutched the edge of the mahogany table for support. His eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were unfocused and watery, darting between the unblinking stoic gaze of the federal agents and the grim, unwavering expression on my face. Rick Barnes did not give them a second to recover. He took a single step forward, his presence commanding the entirety of the room. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh, starkly white document with the official seal of the primary lending institution embossed at the top. The document was clear, cold, and entirely final. He cleared his throat, his voice smooth but punctuated with the icy precision of a seasoned litigator. "I have spent the last 12 hours in direct closed-door consultation with the legal representatives of the commercial bank that funded your recent equity loan," Rick announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the stunned silence. "Because the foundational capital utilized to secure this mortgage was derived from a direct, verified act of interstate wire fraud, the bank has officially exercised the rescission clause. Your entire financial standing regarding this property is now void. The equity you believed you possessed, the 20% stake you supposedly held, has been legally retracted." I watched as Bradley's knees buckled. He slid down the wall until he was crumpled against the wainscoting, his hands covering his face. I stepped into the void. He left, walking toward the center of the room to face the entire assembly of their pretentious, horrified guests. I looked at the extravagant spread, the half-eaten food, and the expensive wine spilled across the floor. "You all seem to be under the mistaken impression that you are standing in a home belonging to Bradley and Tiffany," I said, my voice resonating with a quiet, dangerous power. "Let me correct the record for everyone present. You do not own this house. You do not own the fine china you are eating from. You do not even own the silverware currently sitting on this table. I hold the original deed to this property, and I own 80% of the equity through a series of cash injections you were never meant to understand. The bank has officially classified the remaining 20% as the proceeds of criminal activity and has initiated a full seizure. As of this exact moment, this entire estate is no longer your sanctuary. It is a crime scene." I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew a formal laminated notice. I walked over to the center of the table and laid the document flat right in the center of the ruined turkey platter. I did not look at my son. I looked at the entire room, watching the realization dawn on their faces. "You have 72 hours to vacate my property," I declared, my voice devoid of any warmth or paternal regret. "I have coordinated with the local authorities to ensure that after this time frame, the locks will be changed, and any remaining belongings will be cleared for auction to begin recouping the stolen commercial capital. If you attempt to access the bank accounts associated with this address, you will find them entirely frozen. If you attempt to use the credit cards linked to the household expenses, they will be declined by the merchant. Your world has been systematically dismantled because you chose to build it on a foundation of theft and betrayal." The guests began to scramble. Chairs scraped harshly against the hardwood as people stood up in a panicked rush, eager to escape the suffocating presence of federal agents and the raw, uncomfortable stench of a collapsing life. Some looked at me with open pity, others with pure, unadulterated fear, but none of them dared to speak. They hurried toward the front door, their holiday plans disintegrated, leaving the dining room as a tomb for the extravagant lie that had finally reached its end. Bradley remained on the floor, his frame shaking with deep, racking sobs that sounded like the cries of a wounded animal. He dragged himself forward across the rug, clawing at my pant leg with desperate, white-knuckled fingers. He looked up at me, his face a tragic mask of snot tears and complete total desperation. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for another chance at the company. He went for the one thing he believed I could never ignore. "Dad, please," he wailed, his voice muffled by his own frantic crying. "You cannot do this to us. I am begging you to look at the bigger picture. What about Leo? Where is he going to sleep on Friday night when you force us out into the street? You are a grandfather. You claim to love him more than anyone. You cannot do this to your own grandson. Think about what you are taking away from a child who has done absolutely nothing to deserve this. Please, for the sake of Leo, stop this madness right now." I looked down at my son, seeing not the man I had raised, but the hollow shell of a person who had prioritized greed over his own blood. The mention of Leo was a calculated final move, a desperate attempt to weaponize the only remaining thread of my affection. It was the ultimate final betrayal, the last attempt to manipulate a heart he had already spent years methodically breaking. I stood over him, my expression hardening into stone. I did not feel the surge of pity he expected. Instead, I felt the cold, sharp clarity of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. My grandson would not be raised in a home built on theft, coercion, and the planned imprisonment of his own grandfather. If I had to tear this house down to save him from the corruption, then that was exactly what I would do. I leaned down, bringing my face close to his, my voice a whisper that carried the finality of an executioner. You should have thought about Leo before you decided to lie to me about my own mind. You should have thought about his future before you chose to sell my life out to bail out your brother-in-law. Leo is going to be just fine, Bradley. He is going to be raised by someone with a shred of integrity, which is more than you ever proved capable of. The game is finished. The house is mine. You have your 72 hours. Use them wisely because there is no help coming for you. I stood straight, turned my back on the pathetic scene, and walked toward the entrance. Rick and the agents followed, leaving Bradley to weep on the floor of a house that no longer belonged to him. The cold air of the outdoors felt like a victory, a crisp, clean slate waiting for the aftermath. I had reclaimed my life, and for the first time in years, I was truly, completely, and utterly free from the monsters I had fed. I stood perfectly still in the grand, arched doorway of the dining room, looking down at my treacherous son. Bradley was kneeling on the hardwood floor, his tailored suit deeply wrinkled and stained with fresh tears. The frantic, hyperventilating sobs continuously racking his body sounded incredibly loud in the otherwise paralyzed room. He kept his flushed face buried in his trembling hands, desperately waiting for me to step forward and offer a familiar lifeline. He was waiting for the reassuring voice that had bailed him out of every single mistake he had ever made. But that father was entirely gone. I did not yield a single inch. I did not soften my rigid posture, and I did not reach out to comfort the man who meticulously plotted to completely erase my existence. I looked at him with the cold, detached calculation of a man inspecting a structurally unsound foundation that had finally permanently given way. Bradley peeked through his fingers, searching my face for any trace of paternal weakness. Finding absolutely nothing but stoic resolve, a fresh wave of panic washed over him. He opened his mouth, desperately searching for another emotional string he could violently yank to save himself from impending financial ruin. I knew exactly what he was attempting to do. He thought he could use my love for my grandson as a human shield. He believed the sheer thought of little Leo suffering would force me to cancel the eviction and walk away. I had anticipated this exact manipulation hours before I even stepped foot inside this house. I turned and signaled to Rick Barnes. My attorney stepped forward holding one final manila folder. He handed it to me with a respectful nod. I unclasped the tab and pulled out a stack of watermarked legal documents. The papers were pristine and entirely devastating to the final remnants of Bradley's desperate strategy. I held the stack of papers in my right hand, making sure both Bradley and Tiffany could clearly see the blue ink signatures and official notary seals. You honestly believed I would walk into this room without securing the innocent person living under this roof? I asked, my voice slicing through the stagnant air. You thought you could use my grandson as a bargaining chip to maintain your lavish lifestyle. You miscalculated my commitment to that boy. I stepped closer, forcing him to look directly at the legal paperwork. This is an irrevocable trust established exclusively for Leo. I spent the morning drafting this with Rick. It is ironclad, heavily fortified, and immune to any legal challenges. Tiffany stopped crying, her tear-streaked face snapping toward the documents. Her greedy instincts automatically flared, desperate for any potential source of capital that could save her from the street. But I swiftly shut down that fleeting hope. Leo's future is secure, I stated coldly, articulating every word with crushing finality. Every aspect of his well-being has been accounted for. His future private school tuition, his healthcare coverage, his college fund, and daily living expenses are locked permanently inside this trust. The capital is substantial, and it will guarantee he never has to worry about his financial stability. But there is a specific, uncompromising condition written into the core framework of this document. The trust is overseen entirely by Rick Barnes and independent federal fiduciaries. Bradley slumped further toward the floor, the last remnants of color draining from his face as the sheer magnitude of his failure truly settled over him. Neither of you will ever touch a single penny of it, I declared, driving the final nail into their financial coffin. You cannot use it to pay off your credit card debts. You cannot leverage it to buy a smaller luxury home. You cannot divert a single dollar to bail out fraudulent business ventures or hire criminal defense attorneys. The money belongs exclusively to Leo, and the fiduciaries have unyielding instructions to distribute funds directly to the institutions he requires. You have absolutely zero access, zero control, and zero authority over this capital. I watched the realization hit them like a physical shockwave. I had surgically stripped them of their final piece of leverage. I had ensured that their son, my precious grandson, would be meticulously cared for, entirely insulated from the catastrophic fallout of their criminal actions. But they would be left with absolutely nothing. They would face the brutal reality of their choices without financial safety net. They were officially bankrupt, homeless, and facing imminent federal prosecution. The luxurious life they had built on a foundation of theft and elder abuse was annihilated. I placed the trust documents back into the folder and handed them to Rick. The corporate attorney secured the paperwork inside his briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a definitive, satisfying click. I looked at Tiffany, whose mother was awkwardly trying to console her from a safe distance, terrified of being implicated in the fallout. I looked at Bradley, who was staring blankly at the ruined turkey platter, his chest heaving with silent, defeated sobs. They were a pathetic sight, stripped of their arrogant facades and exposed as the desperate criminals they truly were. I had nothing left to say to them. I had delivered the truth, reclaimed my stolen legacy, and secured the future of my grandson. The paternal duty that had tethered me to my son for 40 years was now dissolved, replaced by a cold, abiding peace. I survived their betrayal and emerged exponentially stronger. I stepped back physically, removing myself from the wreckage of their lives. I adjusted my suit jacket and turned my attention to the silent federal agents standing by the arched entrance. Their stoic presence maintained absolute order in the room, keeping the chaotic family entirely paralyzed with fear. Now it was their turn to execute the final phase. The lead agent stepped forward, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his demeanor radiating an incredibly intimidating official calm. He bypassed the terrified guests and walked directly toward Bradley. He stopped a few feet away from my broken son, casting a long shadow over the weeping man. The agent did not offer a hand to help Bradley off the floor. He simply looked down at him, his voice carrying the heavy, inescapable weight of federal law. "Sir?" The lead agent said, his tone sharp and commanding, instantly cutting through the remaining tension in the room. "We are going to need you to stand up and step outside with us right now. We need a formal word regarding your forged signatures on the power of attorney documents and the subsequent wire transfers. You are officially part of an active federal investigation." Bradley slowly raised his tearful head, his flushed face a portrait of absolute terror. The crushing reality of federal prison, of permanently losing his freedom, his home, and his entire identity was staring him directly in the face. He looked at me one final time, a silent, desperate plea for a miraculous rescue that would never come. I met his pleading gaze with unyielding glacial indifference. I turned my back and began to walk away, leaving him to face the devastating, inescapable consequences of his monumental greed. The heavy footsteps of the plainclothes federal agents echoed against the polished hardwood floors as they guided my son out of the dining room. Bradley did not fight them. He did not resist. He moved with the sluggish, defeated gait of a broken man who had completely surrendered to the crushing gravity of his monumental hubris. The lead agent kept a firm, highly professional grip on his right arm, marching him swiftly past the lavish holiday feast and out into the grand, expansive foyer. I listened closely and heard the distinct, heavy thud of the solid mahogany front door opening and closing, a sound that officially severed the twisted parasitic bond my son had maintained with my wealth for so many years. He was gone, absorbed instantly into the immense, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. Inside the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic, suffocating shame. Tiffany remained completely frozen near the head of the dining table, her perfectly tailored silk designer dress now a stark contrast to the absolute ruin surrounding her. Her parents, who had been so incredibly arrogant and eager to defend her honor just moments ago, were paralyzed, staring blankly at the floor in profound, inescapable humiliation. The extended family members sat in absolute silence, entirely trapped in the sudden wreckage of a holiday celebration built entirely on stolen money and malicious fraud. The silence was absolute, heavy, and pregnant with the inevitable realization that their luxurious fantasy was completely obliterated. Tiffany slowly lifted her head, her expensive makeup running in dark, jagged streaks down her pale cheeks. She looked around the ruined room, her wide, desperate eyes searching frantically for any remaining lifeline. Finding none among her horrified relatives, her gaze locked directly onto me. I had paused just near the arched doorway, allowing Rick Barnes a moment to collect the final legal documents from the edge of the table. Tiffany took a hesitant, trembling step forward. The sheer panic radiating from her entire body was palpable in the freezing air. She reached her shaking hands out toward me, her voice trembling with a fabricated, desperate sorrow. She was ready to deploy the ultimate pathetic defense mechanism of a cornered manipulator. She was going to cast all the blame entirely onto her husband. "Harrison, please, you have to listen to me," Tiffany cried, her voice echoing shrilly against the high ceiling. "I did not want any of this to happen. I swear to you, I never wanted to hurt you." Bradley was the one pushing for the emergency conservatorship. Bradley was the one who physically forged the signatures on those commercial loans. I was just blindly following his lead because I was so terrified about my brother losing his logistics company. He completely manipulated me, Harrison. He told me it was the only possible way to save our family from total bankruptcy. You know how controlling he can be. You know I have always respected you deeply. Please do not group me in with his criminal mistakes. I am just as much a victim of his blind ambition as you are today. You cannot put me out on the street. I am the loving mother of your grandson." Her tearful, frantic plea hung in the stagnant air of the dining room. It was an incredibly transparent, deeply insulting performance. She was actively attempting to rewrite the concrete reality of the last 48 hours, entirely ignoring the fact that I had silently listened to her explicitly demand the falsified medical evaluation. I had heard the pure, venomous hatred in her shrill voice when she eagerly orchestrated my institutionalization. I did not let her utter another single syllable of her toxic, self-serving narrative. I raised my right hand, holding it up in a firm, unyielding gesture that instantly and completely silenced her hysterical weeping. "Do not dare insult my intelligence by playing the helpless, manipulated wife right now," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, quiet register that carried an immense, uncompromising power. "I heard your voice on those hidden recordings, Tiffany, I heard you bitterly complain about the cost of the corrupt medical specialist. I heard you demand that the legal documents be exponentially expedited so you could finally drain the last remaining drops of my financial portfolio. You were not a passive victim in this scheme. You were the eager, malicious architect of a plot to lock me in an asylum forever. You were perfectly willing to steal my freedom to fund your brother. I lowered my hand and looked directly at the head of the long mahogany table. The empty chair, beautifully draped in expensive fabric, sat silently at the end of the ruined feast. I let my cold gaze sweep over the luxurious spread, the polished silver serving dishes, and the towering floral centerpieces that my stolen money had purchased. You told me on Monday that maybe one day I would earn a seat at your table, I said, staring directly into her terrified, trembling eyes. You stood proudly on the front porch of this very house and told me I was a disruptive presence who needed to learn his exact place in your perfect life. You were right, Tiffany. But the truth is, this is my table. I bought this house. I bought the food you are serving today. I financed the entire grand illusion you have been proudly displaying to your family. You are the ones who no longer deserve a seat at it. Tiffany let out a choked, devastated gasp, physically collapsing backward into the heavy wooden chair behind her. She buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly, entirely broken by the sheer, undeniable reality of her own malicious actions. Her parents did not move to comfort her. They simply sat in the agonizing, humiliating silence of a family, completely stripped of their pretentious pride. I turned my broad back on the crying woman, the ruined holiday feast, and the shattered illusion of my son's fraudulent life. I walked out of the formal dining room alongside Rick Barnes, leaving the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the mansion completely behind me. The grand foyer felt remarkably empty and hollow now. The luxurious decorations and expensive furniture no longer projected wealth and success to the outside world. They only looked like the discarded remnants of a failed criminal enterprise. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped out onto the wide stone porch. The freezing, crisp autumn air hit my face instantly, clearing my lungs and washing away the toxic stench of their absolute greed. The sky above Chicago was still gray and heavy, but the suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for months was entirely gone forever. I walked down the long circular driveway toward my parked truck, my footsteps steady and resolute against the cold pavement. I had lost the son I thought I knew, but I had successfully protected the legacy I built with my own hands. Leo was perfectly safe. The vast fortune was completely secure. I opened the heavy metal door of my truck, climbed inside the dark cabin, and started the roaring engine smoothly today. The drive away from the Winnetka estate that Thursday afternoon marked the absolute end of an era. I did not look back in the rearview mirror as my heavy truck rolled down the pristine suburban street. I left the chaos, the screaming, and the shattered crystal wine glass far behind me. 3 months passed since that explosive Thanksgiving afternoon. The brutal Chicago winter had slowly melted away, giving way to the cold, muddy thaw of late February. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding, and terrifying inevitability. Once it finally locks onto a target, it absolutely does not let go. Bradley learned this harsh reality in the most devastating manner possible. He was currently sitting in a federal holding facility located in the downtown district. His expensive, custom-tailored Italian suits had been unceremoniously replaced by a standard-issue coarse orange jumpsuit. He was facing a massive federal indictment for interstate wire fraud, money laundering, and severe elder financial abuse. Rick Barnes and the specialized federal agents had handed the federal prosecutors an entirely airtight case. There were no loopholes, no clever legal maneuvers, and no expensive corporate defense attorneys willing to risk their reputations to save him. Bradley had spent the last 90 days weeping in a concrete cell, begging his court-appointed public defender to somehow negotiate a significantly reduced sentence. He was desperately offering to testify against Derek, entirely willing to completely sell out his brother-in-law in exchange for any shred of leniency. The arrogant corporate executive who thought he could effortlessly steal my life and lock me in an asylum was now bartering for his own miserable survival. Tiffany had not fared much better in the aftermath of her monumental greed. With the federal government freezing all their joint accounts and the commercial bank immediately seizing the Winnetka mansion, her carefully curated socialite existence had evaporated overnight. She had been abruptly forced to move into an incredibly cramped, poorly insulated one-bedroom apartment on the far western outskirts of the city. Without my stolen money to fund her luxury lifestyle, she had taken a humiliating minimum wage job, working as a front desk receptionist at a local discount dental clinic. Her wealthy friends from the exclusive country club had entirely abandoned her the exact moment the scandalous news broke. Her parents had returned to Atlanta, deeply humiliated and utterly unwilling to financially support a daughter who had maliciously orchestrated such a heinous crime. She was forced to take the public bus to work every single morning, sitting quietly in the back, entirely stripped of her pretentious pride and her designer wardrobe. She was finally living the exact reality she had desperately tried to avoid. I stood on the wide stone porch of the Winnetka mansion one final time. The massive house was completely empty now. It had been systematically stripped of its expensive modern furniture, its pretentious artwork, and its hollow memories. The echo of my heavy boots resonated loudly against the bare hardwood floors as I walked through the grand foyer. Rick Barnes stood beside me holding a black leather legal folio in his steady hands. I took the heavy silver pen he offered and signed my name on the final line of the real estate transfer documents. The property had sold incredibly fast, purchased by a young, humble couple who sincerely intended to fill the immense space with genuine love rather than toxic greed. As I handed the silver pen back to my trusted attorney, I paused for a moment. I braced myself for a sudden wave of grief or paternal nostalgia. I fully expected to feel the heavy, suffocating sorrow of a father finalizing the permanent erasure of his son from his life. But as I looked around the empty living room, there was nothing. I felt absolutely no grief. The deep, agonizing pain that had weighed heavily on my chest for months was completely gone. I had surgically cut out the malignant cancer that was actively destroying my family tree, and I felt nothing but a profound, abiding peace. I shook Rick by the hand, thanking him quietly for his unwavering loyalty, and walked back out to my truck. I had a very important schedule to keep this afternoon. I drove across town navigating the familiar suburban streets until I reached the private elementary school. The final bell rang loudly, and a stream of energetic children poured out of the double glass doors. I saw Leo immediately. He was running toward me, his heavy backpack bouncing against his small shoulders, a massive unburdened smile lighting up his young face. He threw his arms around my legs, and I bent down to lift him high into the air, holding him tightly against my chest. We drove to his absolute favorite local ice cream parlor, sitting together in a red vinyl booth near the large front window. I watched him happily eat his massive chocolate sundae, his small hands sticky with sweet syrup. He was entirely safe. He was completely insulated from the chaotic, humiliating ruin his parents had deliberately brought upon themselves. The irrevocable trust I had carefully established guaranteed that his future was completely secure. It was overseen by meticulous federal fiduciaries who would ensure he never wanted for anything, while ensuring his parents could never touch a single dime. I sat there sipping a cup of hot black coffee, reflecting on the arduous, treacherous journey of the last few months. I had lost a son to the corrosive, blinding power of pure greed. I had watched my own flesh and blood attempt to lock me away simply to acquire a few $1,000,000. But in the painful process of losing Bradley, I had successfully protected my innocent grandson, and I had permanently reclaimed my own autonomy. I looked at the bright, joyful face of the little boy sitting across from me, and I knew I had made the only correct choice. I had navigated the darkest, most treacherous waters of familial deception and managed to pilot my ship back into a safe, quiet harbor. My mind was sharper than ever, untethered from the heavy burden of providing for ungrateful, malicious predators hiding behind the sacred title of family. I was firmly in control once more. The commercial real estate properties were completely, absolutely secure. The commercial warehouses were unencumbered by illicit debt. The immense fortune was thoroughly protected behind ironclad legal walls. I took a final sip of my black coffee, feeling the comforting warmth slowly spread through my tired chest, erasing the lingering chill of the past. I looked out the large glass window at the busy city street, silently watching the endless, vibrant stream of anonymous people walking quickly by, carrying their own hidden burdens. I finally placed the heavy ceramic mug back down on the red table with a firm, decisive clink that perfectly punctuated my newfound freedom. I spent my entire life building foundations out of steel and concrete. It took me 70 years to realize that if the people standing on them are rotten, you have to tear it all down and build it again. And this time, the foundation is bulletproof. The hardest truth a parent can ever face is that unconditional love cannot cure deeply rooted greed. When a child chooses to view you as a disposable financial resource rather than a human being, you must have the absolute courage to walk away. Protecting your legacy is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary act of profound self-preservation. You cannot heal someone who is actively holding the knife. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine gratitude. If those pillars are missing, you must tear down the structure and save yourself from the collapse. If this story resonated with your heart, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace? Share your journey with us right now. Your brave experiences truly help others find their own strength.